In the summer of 1945, the world stood at the edge of a precipice. 6 years of total war had claimed tens of millions of lives. Cities had been reduced to ash. Entire generations had been erased. Oceans had become graveyards. The machinery of industrial civilization had been turned entirely toward destruction, and that destruction had been thorough, methodical, absolute. And yet, despite everything, despite the unimaginable scale of death and devastation, the war in the Pacific showed no sign of ending. Japan, battered and burning, its cities reduced to rubble, its people starving, its military shattered, refused to surrender. At the center of this refusal stood a paradox, a contradiction so profound that it would determine the fate of millions. Emperor Hirohito, a man considered divine by his people, a living god descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu, the embodiment of an unbroken imperial line stretching back more than 2,000 years, possessed almost no political power in the conventional sense. He did not command armies. He did not dictate policy. He did not issue orders or overrule his ministers. He sat, silent and distant, while military leaders made decisions in his name, while generals planned campaigns, while admirals sent fleets to their destruction. For most of the war, he had been a symbol, not a sovereign, a presence, not a power. And yet, in August of 1945, this same man would make a decision that no general, no admiral, no cabinet minister could make. A decision that would end the deadliest conflict in human history. A decision that would require him to do what no Japanese emperor had done in over 2,000 years. Speak directly to his people and tell them that everything they had believed, everything they had sacrificed, everything they had fought and died for had come to an end. That the war was lost, that Japan would surrender. This is the story of how one man's voice, rarely heard, stopped a war that seemed unstoppable. It is the story of how silence ended and what that ending meant. To understand what happened in those final desperate days of August 1945, you must first understand what it meant to be the Emperor of Japan. Hirohito was not a ruler in the Western sense. He was not a king who issued commands or a president who debated policy with advisors. He was not even a military dictator, despite the fact that Japan's military ruled in his name. He was something older, something more fundamental to Japanese identity, something that reached back through centuries of tradition and myth. He was the living embodiment of the nation itself, the direct descendant of gods, the repository of 3,000 years of unbroken imperial lineage, the sacred center around which Japanese civilization revolved. This divine status created a strange constitutional reality, a system of power that seemed to contradict itself at every turn. The emperor reigned but did not rule. He sanctioned decisions but rarely initiated them. He was consulted on matters of state but was not expected to impose his personal will. His role was to embody consensus, to provide the sacred seal of approval to choices made by others, to serve as the moral and spiritual anchor of the nation without actually steering its course. To speak out, to assert personal will, to override his advisors would be to violate the very nature of imperial authority. It would suggest that the emperor was a mere human being, making human judgments, subject to human error, capable of being wrong. And if the emperor could be wrong, then the entire foundation of Japanese political culture would collapse. And so, for most of the war, Hirohito had remained silent. He attended meetings of the Supreme War Council. He listened to reports from the front, to casualty figures, to assessments of Japan's strategic position. He asked questions, occasionally, in careful, indirect language that allowed his ministers to interpret his concerns without him having to issue direct commands. But he did not command. He did not forbid. He did not impose. Even as Japan's cities burned, even as its navy was destroyed, even as its people starved in the streets, even as the military dragged the nation deeper into an unwinnable war, the emperor maintained the posture of divine restraint. This silence was not cowardice, it was not indifference, it was tradition, the accumulated weight of centuries pressing down on one man's shoulders. To break that silence would be to acknowledge that Japan was no longer a nation guided by divine will, but a nation facing annihilation at the hands of its enemies and its own refusal to accept reality. By the summer of 1945, that annihilation seemed inevitable to anyone willing to see it clearly. American forces had island-hopped across the Pacific, seizing territory at terrible cost, leaving behind graveyards on tiny coral atolls with names that would be seared into memory. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each battle had been more savage than the last. Each had demonstrated both the Americans' overwhelming material superiority and the Japanese military's willingness to fight to the death rather than surrender. American submarines had strangled Japan's supply lines, sinking merchant vessels faster than they could be replaced, cutting off the flow of oil and raw materials that kept the war machine running. American bombers had incinerated Tokyo in a single night of firebombing in March 1945, killing more than 100,000 civilians in a firestorm that could be seen for 100 miles. The raid had been followed by similar attacks on Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, and dozens of smaller cities. Japan was burning methodically from one end to the other, and yet Japan's military leadership would not surrender. To them, surrender was not merely defeat. It was not simply the loss of a war, the kind of setback that nations had experienced throughout history. It was spiritual annihilation, the destruction of everything that made Japan Japan. They spoke of Ketsugo, the final battle, in which every man, woman, and child would be mobilized to fight to the death on the home islands. They spoke of the Yamato spirit, the warrior code that chose death over dishonor, that found meaning in sacrifice, that saw surrender as a fate worse than extinction. They spoke of fighting until the last Japanese soldier fell, and then fighting still, with civilians armed with bamboo spears if necessary, until the Americans drowned in Japanese blood. This was not rhetoric designed to rally the troops. This was not propaganda meant to stiffen morale. This was doctrine, deeply held belief, the product of centuries of military culture. Japan's warrior traditions had been forged over generations, refined during the Meiji Restoration when Japan modernized its military along Western lines while maintaining its spiritual core, and weaponized during the expansion across Asia in the 1930s and early 1940s. The concept of surrender was absent from the military vocabulary. Soldiers were expected to die rather than be captured. Field manuals made no provision for retreat or capitulation. Officers carried swords not as decoration but as instruments of ritual suicide should they fail in their duty or face capture. The idea of laying down arms, of admitting defeat, of begging for terms from the enemy was incomprehensible. It was not an option. It was not even a concept that could be seriously entertained. And so, even as Japan burned, even as its people starved, even as American forces gathered for what promised to be the final apocalyptic invasion of the home islands, its leaders planned for one last battle that would consume the entire nation in flames. Then came Hiroshima. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a single American B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay dropped a single bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, contained 64 kilograms of uranium-235. When it detonated at an altitude of 600 meters, it released energy equivalent to 16,000 tons of TNT. In an instant, in a flash of light brighter than the sun, 70,000 people were killed. The number is almost abstract in its enormity. 70,000 lives ended in a fraction of a second. Tens of thousands more would die in the following days and weeks from burns that could not be treated, from radiation sickness that no one understood, from injuries that overwhelmed what little remained of the city's medical infrastructure. The city itself ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Buildings evaporated, streets melted, shadows of human beings were burned into walls, the only remaining evidence that they had ever existed. A new word entered human vocabulary, a word that would define the second half of the 20th century: atomic bomb. The news reached Tokyo slowly, in fragments, in confused and contradictory reports. Communications with Hiroshima had been severed. Radio contact was lost. Initial reports suggested a massive conventional bombing raid, perhaps using a new type of incendiary bomb. But as the hours passed, as survivors began to trickle out of the destruction, as reconnaissance aircraft flew over the ruins, it became clear that something unprecedented had occurred. Something that defied explanation. A single bomb had destroyed an entire city. The implications were staggering, world-changing, impossible to fully comprehend. And even then, even faced with this new reality, Japan's military leaders did not move toward surrender. Instead, they argued that the bomb was a one-time weapon, that America could not possibly have more, that the uranium or plutonium required was too rare, too difficult to produce. They argued that Japan could endure even this, that the civilian population would accept any sacrifice, that the warrior spirit would overcome even atomic fire. The Supreme War Council met in the stifling heat of early August. They debated, they considered options. They reached no conclusion. The deadlock held. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. This bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, used plutonium instead of uranium. It was more powerful than the first. 40,000 people died instantly. The death toll would eventually rise to 70,000. And on that same day, in a carefully coordinated move that had been planned for months, the Soviet Union, which had maintained an uneasy neutrality in the Pacific War despite being allied with the United States and Britain against Germany, declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with overwhelming force. Soviet tanks rolled across the border. Soviet aircraft filled the skies. The Japanese Kwantung Army, once considered the most powerful force in Asia, collapsed within days. Japan was now surrounded, burning, and facing enemies on all sides. Its cities were being erased one by a weapon that seemed limitless in its destructive power. Its people were starving, with food supplies cut off by the submarine blockade. Its military was shattered, reduced to planning suicidal last stands. And still, impossibly, the Supreme War Council could not agree on surrender. The council consisted of 6 men, the most powerful figures in what remained of the Japanese government: the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Army Minister, the Navy Minister, and the Chiefs of Staff for both services. They met in the sweltering summer heat in an underground bunker beneath the Imperial Palace as American B-29 bombers circled overhead and air raid sirens wailed across the city. The debate was bitter, fundamental, existential. 3 members favored accepting the Potsdam Declaration, the Allied terms for surrender that had been issued in July. The declaration called for Japan's unconditional surrender, the occupation of its territory, the disarmament of its military, and the prosecution of war criminals. But it also contained a single provision that mattered more than all the others combined. It did not explicitly demand the abolition of the emperor system. This created a narrow opening, a possibility that Japan could surrender while preserving the imperial institution, the sacred center of Japanese civilization. The 3 members who favored acceptance argued that this was the best Japan could hope for, that any delay would only bring more destruction, that the emperor's position must be preserved at all costs. 3 members opposed any surrender at all, or at minimum demanded that Japan insist on additional conditions before laying down arms. They argued that Japan should fight on, that it should demand guarantees. No occupation of the home islands, no war crimes trials. Japan's own disarmament carried out by Japanese forces rather than imposed by the Allies. Preservation of the existing government structure. To accept unconditional surrender, even with the emperor preserved, was to invite humiliation and enslavement. Better to die as a nation than to live in dishonor. Hour after hour, through the blistering heat of early August, the debate continued. No consensus emerged. The military representatives would not budge. To them, surrender meant the end of everything. It meant that all the sacrifices, all the millions of dead, all the suffering had been for nothing. It meant that Japan would be occupied by foreign armies, that its women would be violated, that its culture would be destroyed, that its people would become slaves. Better to fight and die than to accept such a fate. Under the Japanese constitutional system, decisions of the Supreme War Council required unanimity. Without it, the council was paralyzed, incapable of action. The Prime Minister, Kantaro Suzuki, a retired admiral in his late 70s who had survived an assassination attempt during a military coup in 1936, knew that time was running out. American bombers were destroying what little remained of Japan's infrastructure. The Soviets were advancing through Manchuria, crushing what remained of Japanese forces there. Another atomic bomb could fall at any moment. on Tokyo, on Kyoto, on any of the cities that still stood. Every day of delay brought more death, and so Suzuki made an extraordinary decision. He would ask the emperor to break his silence. He would request that Hirohito do what no emperor had done in modern memory, what violated every principle of the imperial system: intervene personally, voice his own judgment, and impose his will on the deadlocked council. This was not a small request. It was revolutionary. It was a violation of everything the imperial system represented. It would expose the emperor as a human being, making a human choice, taking responsibility for a decision that would forever alter Japan's destiny. It would shatter the illusion of divine detachment, the carefully maintained fiction that the emperor stood above politics, above human concerns, embodying the eternal spirit of Japan rather than making day-to-day decisions about policy and strategy. But Suzuki believed there was no other way. The military would never agree to surrender on their own. They would fight until Japan was erased from the map. Only the emperor's voice could end the paralysis. Only the emperor's authority, the sacred authority that every Japanese person had been raised to revere, could override the military's refusal to surrender. On the night of August 9th, as fires burned across Japan and refugees fled the cities, the council convened again, this time in the emperor's presence. This meeting was called a Gozen Kaigi, an imperial conference, a rare and solemn occasion reserved for the most critical decisions facing the nation. The men gathered in the underground bunker, exhausted, desperate, divided. Above them, the city smoldered from recent bombing raids. The air was thick, suffocating. Outside, the war continued. Prime Minister Suzuki opened the meeting by summarizing the situation with brutal clarity. Japan's military position was hopeless. 2 atomic bombs had been dropped. The Soviet Union had entered the war, shattering any hope of negotiating a conditional peace through Soviet mediation. The blockade was complete. The cities were burning. The people were starving. The question before the council was whether to accept the Potsdam Declaration with the single condition that the emperor's sovereignty be maintained, or to insist on additional terms that the Allies were almost certain to reject. The foreign minister, Shigenori Togo, argued passionately for acceptance. He spoke of the reality facing Japan, the mathematical certainty of defeat, the impossibility of victory. Japan had no leverage, no realistic hope of better terms. The Americans had shown they possessed multiple atomic bombs. The Soviets were carving through Manchuria. Every day of delay brought more destruction, more death, more suffering. The only question that truly mattered was preserving the imperial institution. If the emperor's position could be maintained, if the sacred line could continue, then Japan would survive as a nation, as a culture, as a people. If not, everything would be lost. The identity of Japan itself would disappear. The military representatives disagreed with a passion that bordered on fury. Army Minister Korechika Anami, a career officer who embodied the warrior code, spoke of honor, of the Yamato spirit, of Japan's sacred duty to fight to the last. He argued that surrender would mean the end of Japan as a sovereign nation, that the Allies would dismantle the military, occupy the homeland, destroy traditional culture, and eliminate the emperor system regardless of any promises made now. The Americans could not be trusted. Their promises were worthless. Once Japan surrendered, it would be at their mercy, and they would show no mercy. Better to fight and die with honor than to surrender and be humiliated, enslaved, erased. The debate went in circles, the same arguments repeated with increasing desperation. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. No resolution emerged. The men were exhausted, but they could not agree, would not agree. Finally, just before 2 o'clock in the morning, Prime Minister Suzuki did something unprecedented in modern Japanese history. He turned to the emperor and asked him directly to make the decision, to break the deadlock, to speak. The room fell silent. Every man present understood the magnitude of what was happening. The emperor was being asked to step outside his ceremonial role, to assert personal will, to take responsibility for Japan's fate. This was not how the system worked. This was not how emperors were supposed to behave. And yet, here they were, trapped in a bunker, with their nation burning above them, and only one voice could end the paralysis. Hirohito sat for a moment without speaking. He was 44 years old, slight in build, bespectacled, a man who had spent much of his life studying marine biology, examining specimens under microscopes, cataloguing sea creatures. He was a scholar by temperament, quiet, thoughtful, uncomfortable with confrontation. He had been emperor since 1926. Through the rise of militarism, through the invasion of China, through Pearl Harbor and the expansion across the Pacific, through the slow, grinding defeat that had brought Japan to this moment. He had watched as decisions were made in his name, as millions died under the banner of his divinity. He had maintained silence, as emperors were expected to do, as tradition demanded, as the Constitution required. And now he was being asked to break that silence forever. To speak as no emperor had spoken, to make a choice that would define his reign, his life, his place in history. When he spoke, his voice was soft, formal, laden with the weight of what he was about to say. He spoke in classical Japanese, the formal language of the imperial court, almost incomprehensible to ordinary citizens, but familiar to the men assembled before him. He began by acknowledging the opinions he had heard. He understood the military's desire to fight on, their devotion to the warrior code, their willingness to sacrifice everything for honor. He respected their courage, their commitment, their conviction. But then, carefully, painfully, he made his judgment. He could not bear to see his people suffer any longer. He could not watch Japan be destroyed, city by city, in a battle that could not be won. The atomic bombs had demonstrated a level of destructive power that made further resistance not merely futile, but suicidal. The weapon that had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in an instant could destroy Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, every remaining city. The Americans had shown they possessed these weapons and were willing to use them. The Soviets had entered the war, crushing any hope of a negotiated peace. To continue fighting would be to invite the complete annihilation of the Japanese people, the erasure of Japanese civilization from the earth. He said he would accept the Potsdam Declaration on the condition that the imperial institution be preserved. He would bear the unbearable. He would endure the unendurable. He would accept responsibility for this decision, knowing that it violated everything he had been taught about imperial duty, knowing that future generations would judge him, knowing that he was choosing survival over honor. And then, in a moment that would be remembered forever, in words that some of the men present would repeat for the rest of their lives, he spoke of his concern for his people, not for the military's honor, not for the nation's prestige, not for Japan's position in the world, but for the civilians who would die if the war continued. He spoke of the wounded lying in hospitals with no medicine, of the refugees fleeing burning cities with nowhere to go, of the families who had lost everything and would lose more if the fighting went on. He spoke of his responsibility to them, as their emperor, as the embodiment of the nation, as the one who had to ensure that something of Japan survived this catastrophe. The men in the room wept, some from relief, some from grief, some from shame, some from the shock of hearing their divine emperor speak as a man, with a man's sorrow and a man's burden. Some wept because they knew the decision was right and hated that it had to be made. Some wept because they believed it was wrong and could not accept it. But all of them understood that the emperor had spoken, and in speaking had ended the debate. The decision was made. Japan would surrender. But the war was not over yet. As word of the emperor's decision spread through the military command structure in the hours following the imperial conference, not everyone accepted it. To some officers, particularly younger ones who had been raised in the era of militarism and had never known anything but war, the decision was incomprehensible, a betrayal of everything they believed. They could not accept what they saw as surrender orchestrated by weak-willed politicians who did not understand the warrior spirit, who had never faced the enemy in battle, who were willing to throw away Japan's honor to save their own lives. They believed the emperor had been misled, deceived, pressured into a decision he did not truly support. They believed it was their duty to prevent the surrender, even if it meant defying the emperor himself. After all, the emperor was divine, above human politics. If he had made a wrong decision, it could only be because he had been given bad information, corrupted advice. The true path of loyalty was to save the emperor from his advisors, to restore the warrior code, to fight on until victory or annihilation. On the night of August 14th, as preparations were being made for the emperor's surrender broadcast, these officers launched a coup. It was hastily planned, desperate, driven more by emotion than strategy. They seized control of the imperial palace, blocking the gates, cutting telephone lines, searching for the recording of the emperor's surrender message, which had been made earlier that day for broadcast on August 15th. They believed that if they could destroy the recording, if they could isolate the emperor from his advisors, if they could present him with a fait accompli, they could force him to reconsider. They could restore honor and continue the war. The coup was led by a major named Kenji Hatanaka, a young officer who truly believed he was acting in the emperor's best interests. He and his co-conspirators moved through the palace in the darkness, interrogating officials, demanding to know where the recording was hidden. They killed the commander of the Imperial Guards when he refused to join them. They seized control of the radio station. For several hours, it seemed as though they might succeed. But the coup failed, and it failed because the military establishment, even those who had opposed surrender, would not join a rebellion against the explicit will of the emperor. Key commanders refused to support the coup. The recording, which palace officials had hidden in a safe, could not be found despite hours of searching. By dawn on August 15th, it was clear that the coup had no support, no chance of success. Major Hatanaka and several of his fellow conspirators committed suicide outside the imperial palace. Others were arrested. The attempt revealed how fragile the surrender decision truly was, how close Japan came to continuing a war that would have consumed it entirely. Even after the emperor had spoken, even after the divine voice had been heard and the decision made clear, there were those who could not accept it. The warrior code ran so deep, had been so thoroughly internalized, that some were willing to defy even their god to uphold it. On the morning of August 15th, 1945, at noon, radios across Japan crackled to life with an announcement that had been publicized hours earlier. People gathered around radios in homes, in factories, in shops, in public squares. Many stood at attention, as they had been instructed. For the first time in the history of Japan, the emperor's voice was to be broadcast to the entire nation. Most Japanese had never heard him speak. The emperor existed in a realm of silence and distance, his image seen only in formal photographs, his words transmitted through proclamations written by others. To hear his actual voice was unprecedented, almost unimaginable. When the broadcast began, the audio quality was poor, crackling and distant. The emperor's voice was high-pitched, formal, speaking in classical court Japanese that was almost incomprehensible to ordinary people. He used archaic terms, indirect phrasing, euphemisms that masked the brutal reality of what he was saying. But the message, however obscured by formality, was clear enough. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Hirohito did not use the word surrender. That word did not appear in the speech. Instead, he spoke of accepting the joint declaration of the powers and paving the way for a grand peace for all generations to come. He spoke of enduring the unendurable and bearing the unbearable. He spoke of the devastating new bomb, of the suffering of his people, of his desire to preserve the nation for future generations. He explained that to continue the war would lead only to the extinction of the Japanese people and the destruction of human civilization. He asked his subjects to accept what could not be accepted, to endure what could not be endured. Across Japan, people listened in stunned silence. Some wept openly, some felt relief flooding through them, the relief that the bombing would finally stop, that they might survive, that their children might have a future. Some felt shame and rage at the dishonor of surrender, at the betrayal of all those who had died, believing they were fighting for Japan's survival. And some, having been told for years that their emperor was divine, that Japan was invincible, that victory was certain, struggled to reconcile those beliefs with the human sorrow and resignation they heard in Hirohito's voice. In the days that followed, Japan began the process of surrender. The fighting stopped. American forces began preparations for occupation. Japanese military units across Asia and the Pacific laid down their arms. Some officers committed suicide rather than face the shame of surrender. Some units continued fighting for days or weeks, refusing to believe the war was over. But gradually, inevitably, the machinery of war ground to a halt. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the formal instrument of surrender. American General Douglas MacArthur presided over the ceremony. Representatives from the Allied powers witnessed the signing. The Second World War, the deadliest conflict in human history, was officially over. In the aftermath, historians would debate endlessly what Hirohito knew about Japan's actions during the war, when he knew it, and how much responsibility he bore for the atrocities committed in his name. Some would argue that he had been a passive figurehead, powerless to stop the military's aggression, a man trapped by tradition and circumstance. Others would point to moments throughout the war when he could have intervened and chose not to, when he approved military operations, when he met with commanders and expressed no opposition to their plans. The question of his war guilt would remain contested for decades, a wound that never fully healed in Japanese society. But about one thing there could be no debate. In August 1945, Emperor Hirohito made a decision that no one else could make. He broke with tradition that stretched back centuries, spoke when emperors were expected to remain silent, and chose survival over honor. In doing so, he ended a war that had consumed the world. The human cost of the war in the Pacific is almost incomprehensible, a number so large that it loses meaning. Conservative estimates place the death toll at over 20 million people, the vast majority of them civilians. China alone lost between 15 and 20 million people, perhaps more. The atomic bombs killed over 200,000 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. The firebombing of Tokyo killed more in a single night than either atomic bomb. Hundreds of thousands more died in the battles for the Pacific Islands, in the naval engagements, in the submarine warfare that strangled Japan's supply lines. Millions more died from starvation, from disease, from the collapse of civil society as the war ground on year after year. Had the war continued, the costs would have been catastrophic beyond anything yet seen. American plans for the invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, anticipated millions of casualties on both sides. The invasion was to begin in November 1945 with Operation Olympic, the assault on Kyushu, followed by Operation Coronet, the invasion of the Kanto Plain and Tokyo, in March 1946. American planners estimated hundreds of thousands of American casualties, perhaps a million. Japanese casualties were expected to be far higher. The Japanese military was preparing to arm civilians with whatever weapons could be found, to train women and children for suicide attacks, to turn every city, every town, every village into a fortress that would have to be taken at terrible cost. Every estimate from every source suggested that the home islands would become a graveyard, that Japan would be destroyed, building by building, street by street, that the death toll would dwarf even the horrors that had already occurred. The atomic bombs, as terrible as they were, killed fewer people than the invasion would have. Hirohito's decision prevented that. By choosing surrender, by defying the warrior code that demanded death before dishonor, by speaking when tradition demanded silence, he saved countless lives. Japanese lives, American lives, Soviet lives, Allied lives. The decision was not heroic in any conventional sense. It was pragmatic, painful, born of desperation and the recognition that there was no other choice. But it was the right decision. It was the decision that allowed millions of people to live, to rebuild, to create the future. In the years that followed, Hirohito would remain emperor, though stripped of divine status by the new constitution imposed during the American occupation. The constitution, drafted by American officials and adopted in 1947, transformed Japan into a constitutional monarchy with a democratic government. The emperor became a symbol of the state, without political power, a ceremonial figure who performed rituals and attended state functions. It was, in many ways, a formalization of what he had always been, except now the fiction of divine authority was stripped away, replaced by the acknowledgement that he was a human being, the descendant of emperors, but not himself a god. Hirohito would reign for 44 more years after the war's end, becoming the longest-serving emperor in Japanese history. He would preside over Japan's transformation from a militaristic empire to the world's second-largest economy, from a nation in ruins to a technological powerhouse, from an aggressor feared across Asia to a peaceful democracy. He would travel abroad, meeting with world leaders, attending state functions, always maintaining a dignified silence about his role in the war. He never spoke publicly about the surrender decision. He never explained his reasoning beyond what he had said in the surrender broadcast. He never addressed the question of his war guilt, never apologized for Japan's actions, never accepted personal responsibility for the atrocities committed in his name. His silence in his later years was different from the silence he kept during the war. Before August 1945, his silence was dictated by tradition, by the belief that emperors did not intervene in matters of state. After August 1945, his silence was a choice, a recognition that some questions were too painful, too contested, too dangerous to answer. To speak would be to reopen wounds that Japan was trying to heal. To remain silent was to allow the nation to move forward without confronting its past. When Hirohito died in January 1989, at the age of 87, the question of his responsibility remained unresolved. Some mourned him as a figure who had saved Japan from destruction. Others condemned him as a war criminal who had escaped justice. The debate continues to this day, in Japan and beyond, a reminder that history's judgments are never final, never complete. What remains indisputable is this. In the summer of 1945, when Japan's military leadership was deadlocked and its cities were burning, when the warrior code demanded that the nation fight to the last man, woman, and child, when the machinery of total war seemed impossible to stop, one man chose differently. He chose to speak when silence was expected. He chose surrender when honor demanded death. He chose the survival of his people over the preservation of a tradition. He chose to become human when he was supposed to remain divine. History often imagines that wars end with climactic battles, with generals accepting surrender on the decks of battleships, with tanks rolling into conquered capitals, with flags being raised over fallen cities, and the Second World War did have those moments. There was the fall of Berlin, with Soviet soldiers raising the hammer and sickle over the Reichstag. There was the signing of surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri. There were victory parades and celebrations in the streets of Allied capitals. But the real end of the war, the moment when the choice was made to stop the killing, happened in a bunker beneath Tokyo, in the middle of the night, in stifling heat, with 6 men deadlocked and a nation burning above them. It happened when a man who was supposed to be a god decided to act as a human being, when tradition demanded one thing and survival demanded another, and he chose survival. Hirohito's decision did not erase the horrors that had come before. It did not absolve anyone of responsibility for the atrocities committed in Japan's name, for the millions who died in China, for the prisoners of war who were tortured and murdered, for the civilians massacred across Asia, for the brutality that characterized Japan's conduct throughout the war. It did not answer the deep moral questions about his own culpability, about what he knew and when he knew it, about the moments when he might have spoken earlier and chose not to. Those questions remain, contested and painful, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. But what the decision did was stop the future from becoming even worse than the past. It ended the cycle of destruction before it consumed everything that remained. It chose the possibility of rebuilding over the certainty of annihilation. It chose life over honor, survival over glory, the future over the past. In the end, the deadliest war in human history did not end because one side was completely defeated on the battlefield. It did not end because the losing side ran out of soldiers or weapons or will to fight. It ended because one man, trapped between divinity and humanity, between tradition and survival, between what he was supposed to be and what the moment demanded, chose to break a silence that had lasted for millennia. He spoke, and the war ended. That is the power of a single voice. That is the unbearable weight of the choice it must sometimes make. That is the lesson of August 1945, a lesson about how the greatest acts are sometimes the quietest, how the most important decisions are sometimes made not by generals planning battles, but by individuals choosing to speak when everyone expects silence. Hirohito's voice, rarely heard before that moment and carefully controlled after it, stopped the most destructive war humanity had ever known. Not through force, not through military genius, not through diplomatic skill, but through the simple revolutionary act of saying, "Enough. We will endure the unbearable. We will bear what cannot be borne. We will choose survival." And in that choice, in that single moment of breaking silence, millions of lives were saved, a nation preserved, and a future made possible.